let's get going. So welcome everybody. I am Tara Levine. I'm a senior advisor here at Branchfood, and we are really excited to be hosting this panel on, as we called it, the ins and outs of scaling a food business, which is really going to be a hands-on session of what you need to do to grow a business, especially once you've graduated from an incubator program. I am a senior advisor here at Branchfood. My background is leading brands and businesses at lots of big companies, Gillette, P&G, Ocean Spray here and abroad, Nike, Inari. And as part of Branchfood, our job is really to help food companies grow. We are a food innovation launchpad, and we help accelerate growth by connecting food founders, food investors, food experts like the folks that we have today, and food corporations. And we are so excited to be hosting this panel as part of RIHub's Rhode Island Startup Week, which hopefully you're also attending the many virtual and in-person sessions as well. And today, we really wanted to cover this talk because one of our focus areas within Rhode Island, where we've recently expanded to, is this focus on stage 2 startups. So those food startups that have graduated from an accelerator, an incubator, and are now looking to scale their business. And that's a really, really challenging phase. And so what we wanted to do was provide some of the resources from these experts and leaders around the table today to help you start thinking through some of these things. And in terms of how we're going to do this, obviously, as you all saw, this session is recorded so that we can share it with others who are not able to attend. We'll start with Q&A, and then we'll open it up to questions. You'll see at the bottom a Q&A function. You can put your questions there, and I'll make sure that we can get to as many as possible during the course of our conversation. We're looking forward to a great session. So without further ado, I am going to begin by asking for introductions. So if I could ask each of our panelists to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and your role, especially as it relates to creating and supporting food innovation. So Maggie, can I ask you to kick it off, please?
I love that. Thank you, Tara. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Longo. I'm with the Rhode Island Small Business Development Center, and I am their hospitality, restaurant, and I'll throw food and tourism in there consultant. So I work with many folks who are probably here today on the panel. In my late 20s, I left a career in nonprofit, working in Washington, D.C., where I also was a market farmer, believe it or not, a small-scale market farmer, and ran a cottage food business and decided to focus on food full-time and came to Rhode Island and have been here ever since. So I started in the kitchen, moved my way out front, and I've been doing business advising with clients of all sorts for the last almost 20 years.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hillary, can I ask you to go next?
Of course. Thanks for having me, and good morning, everyone. My name is Hillary Hughes. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Foster Garvey. I'm based in New York, and I chair the food and beverage practice there. We focus mainly on early stage and growing growth stage food and beverage brands and other consumer products like nutritional supplements and beauty and wellness and cosmetics. We also work with fashion and apparel brands, and we do a lot of sports and entertainment work as well. We work with founders, we work with some investors. We help from very early stage when you have a brand concept or a product concept and you want to figure out how to protect the intellectual property. We help you set up an entity, handle early and later stage capital raising, all commercial agreements, manufacturing, distribution, sales, and everything that comes in between, help with equity issuances to employees and employment agreements, real estate needs, equipment finance, M&A and exits, and sort of everything in between.
So it's a short list of topics, Hillary, is what you're saying. So at our launch event in Providence about 2 weeks ago, one of the questions was, what do I need to know from a lawyer that I don't know? And so there's always that fear of you go see a lawyer when you have a problem. So part of our goal today, Hillary, is to make sure that everyone here understands that starting with a conversation with a lawyer rather than going when you need to is actually the best approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. All right, excellent. Kelley, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your company and where you are?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kelley McShane, and I'm CEO of Granny Squibb's Organic Iced Tea. I specialize in revitalizing and growing stagnant brands. Currently at Granny Squibb's, I focus on mostly the forward-facing aspects of the company, so distribution, sales, community partnerships, and outreach.
Excellent. And can you share a little bit, Kelley, about kind of the scale of Granny Squibb and a little bit more about the story behind it?
Sure. So the company was founded in 2009 by Robin Squibb, and it's based on her grandmother's recipe. She always jokes that first year she sold exactly one iced tea. So I'd say that's stage one. And then over the next several years, she secured large grocery partners like Whole Foods and Wegmans and Dave's Marketplace. And then in 2019, my partner, Nick Carr, and I teamed up with her. And at the time we sold, so that year in 2018, we sold approximately 12,500 units, which is like 1,000 cases. And we had 4 SKUs, all in our 16-ounce glass bottles. Then now, 4 years later in 2022, we are doing 18,000 gallon runs every 8 weeks, which is 12,000 cases or 144,000 iced teas. We have 10 SKUs, we have 8 bottle SKUs, and then we introduced 2 flavors in 16-ounce aluminum cans or 12-ounce aluminum cans. We've secured new distribution partnerships and have expanded throughout New England, focusing mostly on natural channels and smaller grab-and-go accounts.
Excellent. So you are a perfect example of that stage 2 startup, probably at the later stage, frankly. You're sort of stage 2B in terms of the scale that you've created and the broader scale that you're going after. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about what your next steps are. So I want to take a pause here because we have a good number of folks who are on the attendee list. And one question that we always ask is about who is attending. So we're going to put a quick poll up so that we can better understand who is here and thereby adjust our questions accordingly. So please click on what role you play, whether it's food founder, member of corporation, expert, investor, student, lots of choices. If you could just complete that now. Oh, I see. It's always exciting when you see it actually happening as you go along. Excellent. So I see a lot of founders and business owners. And also what's really encouraging is we have a lot of what we would call experts, all of the organizations who are supporting and cheerleading and giving resources and providing the scaffolding to help food businesses grow here as well. We've also got some corporate leaders, a couple of investors, some members of the government. This is excellent. All right, well, this is really helpful to know that we've got, a good cross section, but especially in the founder space. That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right. So on that topic then, excellent. Does everybody see it? All right, I'm going to share the results so everyone can see who is here. All right, so now let's get back to this. All right, so we've got a lot of founders. So I'm going to go back to you, Kelley. As we said, you are really a perfect example of a startup leader that is scaling your business. And, certainly as a business leader myself and having worked with so many food startups and food corporations, being able to be clear about what you will do and what you won't do. And as you grow, what are you growing towards? What is the objective? And use that to create, if that's the what, use that to create the how. Can you share a little bit more as you're looking to scale Granny Squibb? What are your priorities? What are your objectives? And what's your how in terms of getting there?
Well, first, I'm certainly not perfect. Definitely not the perfect example, but I'm learning and, we're working hard. And I think that's important to remember that, not to attain perfection, just keep moving and keep rolling and doing every day. But so our plan for the rest of this year and 2023, we are focused on New England. We're going to saturate the market by securing strong partnerships, regional distribution partnerships, and focusing on the smaller grab-and-go accounts and breweries. We'll also be looking to fill the gaps in large grocery chains like Stop and Shop and Market Basket. The discontinuation of Honest Tea has left a $45 million gap in the organic beverage market, and we want to fill that. So in 2023, we'll also be focused on marketing in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania by doing large trade shows and investing in geolocation technology for ad targeting specifically. Once we secure distribution partnerships in those areas, we will build and launch a sales team to support that growth.
Well, that sounds like a pretty robust plan. And it is, you're absolutely right, with Honest Tea being discontinued for the most part. Certainly there are others, including the former founder's product, that will be coming, but you've got this window to be opportunistic. You mentioned distribution and distributor partnerships, which is always a big topic. Can you share just a few insights about, how you've worked with distributors in the past and any kind of tips that you would have to members of the audience looking at those agreements now?
Sure. Distribution partnerships are so important to the growth of your business, and learning how to leverage their sales teams. Companies that are in our stage, we have one other full-time employee besides myself, and then a couple part-time sales people. But, we don't have the capacity to bring on this, gigantic sales team that I desperately want. So what I have learned is to really, create excellent partnerships with the distributors, go and present, get to know their sales team, follow up with their sales team, know their sales team's kids' names, because they're the ones that are going to be out there and selling for you at this stage. And it's hard when, for us, for Granny Squibbs, we're competing with Snapple and Arizona, and it's very easy for these sales team members to go into accounts and just be like, what's your normal order? What do you want? So you have to make sure that people are willing and want to actively sell your product for you. And that comes from them respecting you.
That is such a great point, Kelley. We would often say that the first group that you have to sell to, it's not the consumers, it's not the retailers, it's whatever sales team is selling your product. They have to be your champions. And in many cases, you want to be with them if you can, because you're the best brand ambassador, but you can't be there at every meeting. And you're right, it's really easy to say, oh yeah, this is what you usually do. And to get them motivated is so powerful. And you can be creative in a million different ways to do that. I mean, the contests that are out there, that there's always something fun that you can do as a competition to motivate them. Now, Hillary, I'm going to ask one follow-up also on distributors, because distribution agreements are tricky, and having written many of them and having tried to get out of many of them that I didn't write, getting that squared away is really important. What advice do you give to food founders and food companies when it comes to these kinds of agreements?
Yeah, great question. A lot depends on who the distributor is. Obviously, your negotiating power, and it's very different if it's a small or regional distributor versus a larger one. Some of the big guys like UNFI and KeHE, very little is negotiable in their agreements, but a lot of the smaller ones or regional ones, there are important terms that you can negotiate, things like how long the term of the agreement, how long it's going to last, what the termination rights are to get out of the relationship for both parties. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about the pricing and the ability to change pricing. Distributors generally don't like you to spring price changes on them. So having some control over your own pricing and your need to change it at times is important, as well as the scope of exclusivity. If you're giving exclusivity, is it channel-based? Is it particular retailer-based? Is it territory based and making sure that you don't grant overlapping exclusivity to different distributors. And then of course, payment is really important, and the payment terms. A lot of distributors kind of float the payables for a long time with mailing, using snail mail as opposed to ACH or wire transfer, and calculating the invoice payment date from, you know, when it actually gets, you know, put on the shelves in the warehouse versus when it's received, and a lot of kind of games and shenanigans with that sort of thing. So it's really important to focus on how my payment is going to be calculated and when I'm going to get it. So these are all sort of the key things you focus on in these relationships.
You're absolutely right, Hillary. The devil is always in the details in those kinds of agreements. And I'm probably, I can't see the attendees, but I can imagine when someone says like, oh yeah, the payment terms in terms of when you can get paid versus when you have to pay your manufacturers and so on, that time scale is incredibly important and can make or break a growth plan. Thank you both. So Maggie, I want to ask you the next question, because certainly as a member of the Rhode Island SBDC, you know, you help startups tackle so many different growth issues, whether it's funding, co-manufacturing, and one of the challenges that we hear most often is this idea of being overwhelmed because you're creating the product as you're trying to figure out the growth plan, like what Kelley just laid out. You know, you're flying the plane while you're building the plane. And, you know, I would love your perspective on how you work with founders to help prioritize what are the most important things to focus on, because you can't do everything, and then tackle those and find the support that they need rather than feeling like they need to do it on their own.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And it goes a little bit back to both what Hillary and Kelley are saying. You know, I work with a lot of folks who are what I call artisan. They've just graduated an incubator. They're still at that artisan stage. They're doing bench production, and they think they're ready for the $100 million worth of financing or sales. Often they can't even talk to me about how much it costs to make their product. So I like to go backwards and have everyone pump their brakes a little bit. So we sort of review recipes, we'll review how they're thinking about their sales. Often it's at this point, they start to think in units instead of, well, I sold $10,000 last month. Great, how many units was that? And how do you scale that to capacity? And what are you thinking that looks like? You know, so I'm a very fundamental kind of girl and a bit of a spreadsheet geek, which isn't everyone's forte. So, but being able to have a conversation, I think that's informed and understand how products are made is helpful in that process. So I go backwards before we go forwards. Because once we know how much it costs to make a unit, we can run models 9 ways to Saturday, right? To see what it might look like based on the relationships you're able to make with distributors or retailers.
Yeah, and that P&L and that process of figuring out where all those costs are, because when you go through that process, you start to realize, oh, I am spending more than I thought I would. And and it gives you a level of transparency so that you can make more informed choices. And then going through that process of what are your assumptions about growth, you know, to your point, Kelley, you know, what kind of distribution, what kind of percentages am I giving to a broker, a distributor, a retailer? What am I spending? It just allows you to really kind of take a look at that.
And it allows us to look at where the spend is inappropriate or where the spend needs to be increased. Because often everyone will carry everything in cost of goods sold, and I strip it all the way back to what does it cost me to make my product. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if it was Kelley and I, how much does an ounce of iced tea in your base flavor cost you to make? And then we're going to start to build all the other things, and we're going to carry them in a variety of ways to look at where we can economize mm-hmm. or flex, right? Where we can get some capacity or some traction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in fact, we have a couple of questions in the question list directly related to this. So I'm going to ask it to all three of you, and then you can answer. So the first question is, within the P&L, what's a typical percentage that you usually see going to a broker and or a distributor? Because sometimes they're combined, sometimes they're different.
I think that I'm seeing numbers anywhere from as low as 5 to 7% to as high as 25%. Again, and that's sort of built on capacity, right? And I think Kelley might have some really good insight on this simply because they've gone that route and now they're at this amazing, they're moving pallets, right? Which is really great. It's all over the place. And often they can't answer because they can't get an answer. So I just carry a straight 20% because I figure we take it off the top and we'll build it back in. When we're doing, just sort of, what's the word I want? Discovery financial models. Yeah.
I want to know what distributors are taking 5% because I would like to meet them. But usually, UNFI KE, they'll do like 12%, 13%. But they also take a lot of margin off like breakage and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of chargebacks that you have to pay attention to and, marketing costs and trade costs. So you have to factor all that in. And it ends up, that was actually a really good number, Maggie, like 20%. And then our smaller regional distributors usually take almost 30%, but they're backing you up. They have their sales teams, they're marketing it, they have their team behind you that are supporting you. So it's really what you want. I think there's a very sweet spot between like based on how much volume you're doing. If you're doing a huge volume, then you can kind of afford those chargebacks and that kind of stuff. And you want to do those trade costs, whereas stage 1 and stage 2, I think it's more important to give the distributor a little bit of a bigger margin so that you have the support that you need.
And Kelley, for those who may not know some of the terminology, how do you define chargebacks?
A chargeback is, so if I'm sending my iced tea to the distributor and there's a bottle that was broken in the case, they'll charge me back for the full cost of that case. That's one example. Also, if we do a promotion and reduce our pricing at Whole Foods for 6 weeks, then the distributor we will charge the distributor full price, and then they'll send us a bill to make up that difference. And that's a chargeback.
Excellent, thank you. So there's another question in the Q&A about how do you look at P&L in terms of the percentage that you put against advertising? And I would broaden that to be able to say, advertising, marketing, and then trade as well, as you just talked about, Kelley.
Well, that's a bit complicated. We don't really think of it as a percentage. We're very, very aggressive at Granny Squibbs with our growth plan. And yeah, I don't know quite how to answer that. I would maybe do 30% of your budget for the year into marketing. Yeah, I mean, Maggie and Hillary, you might have a little bit more insight into that or advice.
I look at it a little bit differently than that. I wouldn't quite carry the 30%, but again, like you said, some of the regional distributors sort of offset your marketing payroll costs. So you have to think about where you would carry that portion of their percentage, right? I always start with a flat 10%, just almost as a wake-up call to what that number is. Because if you come to me with your initial profit and loss statement that you've made, and you're showing me you're going to go from 0 to $2.5 million in sales in 18 months. I'm like, okay, so it's going to cost you, this amount to get there, minimum. And I would consider doubling that number. And then that is sort of a bit of a wake-up call, and when I'm working with tiny little folks, I carry 10%.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. And trade spend is a world in and of itself. We have in the chat a seminar link that we've done all about everything you ever needed to know about trade spend, because trade spend can be a really, really valuable way in store to drive trial and then be able to then get the repeat to build a business over time. That idea of you get a spike with a event, a display or something, and then it will always come down, but every time it should come down higher than where it was before. That shows that that event is driving repeat and you're building your customer base. But that is often a place where retailers and distributors will encourage you to spend as much money as you possibly can. And you need to do the homework to make sure that it's actually working for you. That, you know, your trade promotion isn't just hiding a price that's too high. There's a lot going on. So check out that link to get a bit more detail on that. All right, so Hillary, I want to switch over to you to ask the question that I posed a little bit at the beginning, which is, you know, you have so much experience working with startups around legal issues, whether it's distributors, employees. As you think about those startups that are scaling food businesses, what are the key areas from a legal perspective that they need to be addressing? And what are the areas that in your mind typically are the ones that blow up, and how do you get ahead of it and address it in advance?
Yeah, so I would say the two primary ones when you're scaling and moving from stage 1 to stage 2, as we've been referring to it, are getting a co-manufacturing relationship in place. That's probably your most important vendor for so many reasons. So finding the right partnership is super important. And then, of course, keeping your house in order and preparing towards a capital raise. Many brands are doing a larger or more sophisticated capital raise as they enter the scaling process. And so you need to keep an eye on what are investors going to be looking at when they do due diligence. And one of those key components is IP ownership. You want to make sure that anybody who has had any part in creating something or changing or improving something. So that could be obviously the most important, the recipe or formulation or the process for making the product, but also your creative assets, your trademarks, the brand name, any kind of art that you're using on the packaging or for a logo, packaging design itself, your sales material and marketing materials, just making sure that anybody who's helped create anything or change or improve anything has signed something that says that you, preferably your company and not you, the founder, owns that IP, that it was created on your behalf and you own that, because investors are going to be looking at it. And then further down the road, obviously potential acquirers are going to be looking that there's kind of a clean chain of title for IP ownership. And then the third area I'd say is kind of any kind of regulatory or compliance elements. So making sure the claims you're making about your products, whether it's on the packaging or in your marketing materials or how you're pitching it, and how others who are pitching it on your behalf are describing and making claims about the product, are all backed up and allowable, because getting in trouble with regulatory authorities is no fun. Worse than getting in trouble with regulatory authorities is getting hit by some plaintiff's class action suit about misleading or fraudulent advertising about the product. So I'd say those are kind of the three main areas that brands should focus on when they're scaling to the next level.
Great. Thank you, Hillary. I think we're all suitably concerned now, having heard that list. So, you know, the job of a lawyer is to terrify and reassure in equal measures, I think. And so I think
absolutely, that's a great description.
So we appreciate you doing both. All right, so now let's jump into a topic that I feel like we talk about all the time, which is co-manufacturing. And it is often the single biggest requirement to grow a food business, especially once you've sort of grown out of an incubator or, you know, a commercial kitchen in some way. And it can also be an incredibly confusing and incredibly frustrating part of scaling. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak about your perspective and share your advice on this. And I'm going to start, Kelley, with you, you know, as someone who has navigated co-manufacturing, is currently in the midst of navigating that. You know, how have you worked your way through it, and what advice would you give to founders in this topic?
Well, co-manufacturing is essential to your business. Obviously, it's your foundation. At Granny Squibb's, we were grandfathered into our first co-packing partnership, and then this past May, they needed to restructure and could no longer have the capacity to run granny squibs. So this past summer is the first time I've been navigating this like new onboarding process with a distributor. And so my advice would be to budget more time than you think, like a lot more time. This relationship takes a long time to do your due diligence. And find a co-packer that you actually enjoy talking to on a human level. That's very important. If you are able to do business with someone that you actually like, you'll have a lot more fun. And then find an expert or advisor. Do that. Find someone like Hillary that you can speak to. I know a lot of people, founders in this stage, don't have the resources to hire someone to come on and help them, but there's so many resources out there with Maggie and Branchfoods or just other entrepreneurs that have done this process and transferred into the co-packing space. The paperwork, the certifications, the whole onboarding process is confusing and detailed. You need an extra set of pair of eyes. Extra.
Yes, and yes, because it is, in the category of the rabbit hole that you can go down. Co-manufacturing is a very deep and dark rabbit hole, and having a guide along the way is incredibly important. And Maggie, you have been that guide and are that guide for many, many food companies scaling across different parts and categories within food. What's your advice? How do you help startups navigate this process?
Well, I'll amplify what Kelley said. And, one of the first things I always do is you have to know your product and you have to know your process. So what we run up against is, I think it will happen here, and I believe they have the equipment I need. Well, you think this is the right kettle or oven, or have you figured that out? I'm able to make some of the connections just with my food background about how a process might work. Because if you're talking to the wrong potential partner, then you're wasting everyone's time and you become frustrated and disillusioned. I also think that you have to be very clear and careful in your questions and know that it's a huge commitment on your side. It's not like you just hand it off and walk away, because it's most of the folks that I work with, not only is it their brand, it's their identity. And I think even Kelley and her partner feel that way. It's really their identity, and you can't lose control of that. So it's important not to try to go so big. This is this huge manufacturer in the Midwest. First off, let's figure out a way to keep them here in Rhode Island, right? Which is, everyone's nodding. I know, I'm trying. I just need a big checkbook team. But if we could, we need that resource here, because then we'll continue to grow that here.
Yes, that is absolutely right. And knowing your product, knowing what has to happen to make that product, and also in some cases, understanding where your guide, your guardrails are, because co-manufacturers, the bigger the co-manufacturer, the more they'll ask you to make compromises on your packaging or what, and knowing where your bright lines are in terms of, I can't compromise on that is really important to know what you will and won't do.
And I work with a lot of makers who have what they perceive to be proprietary processes. And some of them are, and some of them aren't, but there's a way to navigate it. You're doing something special. Well, how does that work in a commercial setting? Every time you add a hand element or a more human element to the manufacturing process, you increase the cost. So what are your options there? And how do you do that research?
Exactly. And I will put a plug for Polaris MEP here, because they are a great resource in Rhode Island, but also nationally. They have state-by-state organizations who help specifically on the manufacturing side to help you work through some of these questions and challenges. So they're another great expert to tap into. Hillary, from a legal perspective, co-manufacturing agreements, everybody usually shudders when they think about it, but what are the guideposts that you recommend for these?
Yeah, it's a super important relationship as we've been discussing. And so choosing the right partner and understanding that it is a partnership will help you go a long way. Co-manufacturers usually have really thin margins on their pricing, and remembering that they're a business too that needs to make money, and striking kind of a balance in the middle there that makes them excited about the partnership and seeing it as a profitable enterprise for them as well, as opposed to browbeating them into submission on everything is not going to set them up for a good relationship and to feel good about the brand. So kind of understanding that from the beginning, that these are businesses with thin margins and you want them to make money on it too, so they're excited about it. But hand in hand with that is you have to pick the right partner and do your due diligence. Because the margins are so thin, a lot of these businesses are cash strapped and have a lot of debt and are highly leveraged. So we typically recommend doing some due diligence on their financial health and talking to other brands, to the extent they're not a competitor, about their relationship with the co-manufacturer, and really making sure you're picking the right partner. And then your sales strategy should kind of flow in part from where your co-manufacturer is and where your customers are. So if you're signing distributors or retailers that are in one region, and so you're having to make sure inventory levels in a fulfillment center near there are at the right level, and don't go grab some retailer or distributor in a far off place where you now have to float the cash to make sure the inventory levels in two places, maybe before you're ready or have scaled to that point, make sense and are economical. And then just within the relationship, obviously IP is an important concern as well, making sure that any changes that are made to your product at the request or suggestion of the co-manufacturer are owned by you. Understanding what part of process is theirs and what part of process is yours, and making sure that's clearly outlined. Dealing with any kind of minimum purchase requirements and forecasting. All of these are kind of hornet's nests a little bit that you have to navigate and make sure that they make sense. If you don't have a minimum purchase requirement, then don't die on the sword on how long the term of the agreement is and what your termination rights are, because if there's no minimum purchase requirement, then you can just stop placing POs. So all of these things, making sure you have termination rights to get out if there's a problem, or if you're acquired, because many of the large food conglomerates that acquire earlier stage brands don't need a co-manufacturer, they have their own. So you don't want to be locked into some long-term relationship that you can't get out of if you're going to exit the business. So I'd say these are some of the primary considerations, but there's tons of others, like who's sourcing and purchasing the raw materials. Are you doing it? Is the co-man doing it? Do you have some control and transparency on it if the co-man is doing it? There's just a lot of issues to navigate here, and there's a lot of different co-man personalities. Some are much easier to work with than others. Some are scared of contracts, some are not. I mean, in our practice, we literally have 3 forms of co-man agreement. We have like a light form that's 2 pages long for the skittish co-man, and then we have, a 13-page form for the brand that has a little more bargaining power. So, just understanding who you're dealing with and getting a sense of how they do business is really important to building a successful partnership.
Great insight. And it really highlights, Hillary, Kelley, what you were saying in terms of the time that you need to devote to getting that co-manufacturing agreement right, because it's incredibly complex. And co-mans, like, that is not a great business. There is not a lot of margin in co-manufacturing. And so approaching it, as you say, from a, what do they need? What do you need? You still hold your ground, but understanding that ultimately this is a really important partnership. And if one party feels like they're not getting what they need, it ends up being toxic in that way. So it's a really important one to spend the time on, knowing the importance and knowing the complexity. We actually have a question about this topic in terms of like the P&L. How do you even think about, what kind of assumptions do you make about what percentage or what unit cost? How do you think about that? So I'm going to send it first to you, Maggie, as my fellow P&L, lover. How do you think about it? What advice do you give?
I'll go back to what I said. I think at my first question is we have to know what it costs to make your product. Because if we don't have a jumping off point, we can't build a P&L that will address all of your expenses, both known and predictive, as you grow the brand. I always start there, and it's surprising to me that that is a weak point, because again, people are passionate, they're artists, they're artisans, they're creators, and then the idea of like, wait, there's a number. Well, I shop at Whole Foods to buy my ingredients to make my product. Okay, well, let's spin that back a bit, because you're paying retail to then sell wholesale so someone else can retail it, right? So that's where I like to start. When it comes to coming up with how do you make the decision you're ready to co-man on a P&L or what's next, the big problem is always the chicken and egg problem, right? I need the money to buy the supplies and the materials to go the next step. That's hard to navigate, because without the cash, you can't have the supplies and materials. I've been successful recently in working with a few clients who have commitments from big distributors that we are able to get a bridge loan that until they, that will get them to be able to purchase packaging materials in particular at a larger scale to reduce cost, to allow them to then move forward with their process. Did that answer it? I don't know if that answered it.
It did. Thank you. And, as you take a look at that P&L, and you've got your raw material costs, what you think it will take, and then manufacturing, a lot of startups will often use the commercial kitchen that they've been using so far as a basis. How do you make that conversion from here's what it costs to make it at a commercial kitchen versus how much I should think it's probably going to cost at a co-manufacturer, and how much do I have to pay them to do this?
Right. So when you're doing it yourself, when you're self-producing, you have all the expenses associated with operating that business. So you have rent and overhead and different kinds of insurances that will shift when your liability obviously stays, and Hillary could amplify this, but your actual physical space insurances might go away. So how do you take that ball of money that you've accounted for? I usually like to figure out what those percentages are and move that to a co-man line in the beginning. So if you're sharing time, or if you're fortunate enough that you're working in a space where you're only paying $75 a day to do your production and you only need it 2 days a week, that's amazing. So then we have to have a different kind of conversation. Everyone also always feels that they need to staff to the hilt overnight, that they need all these, directors of sales and sales teams and sales managers. And Kelley made it clear that she's their best salesperson. She's building those relationships. Don't over predict when you don't have the sales to support that kind of team. You're not PepsiCo. And that's often kind of the approach. So I turn it back. This cost me this. It was costing me 25% of my revenue or 40% of my revenue. Then I'm going to carry that towards my co-man fees.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful, sort of nuts and bolts guidance. All right, well, I am going to start turning towards questions that I'm seeing here. A lot of them have been answered, but one question that came up, we have someone who's in the process of starting up a food truck and wanted to find out more information about accessing grants or other similar kinds of opportunities for a first-time business owner.
So I have to be the bad person and say that grants typically do not exist for startup businesses. That's not 100%, but I'm going to say it's 99.9% true. There's a really great process and some great tools that the state offer to launch a food truck business. And actually, I know that you shared the contact information for the SBDC earlier in the chat stream. If you register with us, we'll be able to support you through those processes. It's really clear cut, but free money is going to be hard to find.
Kelley, have you found any opportunities, whether it's like in Rhode Island, grants or so on?
Yeah, well, I mean, over the last 2 years in response to COVID-19, there have been a lot of grants and resources like the revolving fund and Take It Outside grant that was, I'm so very grateful for. I know Commerce Corporation has a lot of great resources. You can go on, they'll share that with you, but, I agree with Maggie, there's not a lot of free money out there if you can't prove what you're doing. The food and beverage space, unless you're doing something crazy and wild that's going to save the world, you're not really going to get a lot of backup. But there's a lot of loans out there and opportunities. So I would just, do your research and get involved with, Commerce Corp and Branch Foods. Branch Foods, you exist to help food and beverage entrepreneurs grow their businesses. You're here to help us. So really, really take advantage of that.
Thank you for the plug, Kelley. And yes, we are. We'll share later information about how to connect with us and how to sign up for our newsletter. Because yes, part of our role is to help you identify where you might be able to access resources. So we have a couple of interesting questions around retail versus food service. And the sort of differences and pros and cons. So I'll open this up to the panel to talk about those differences between those two channels and how you prioritize and how you sell into those.
In retail is in retailing yourself and then working with a food service provider.
I would say selling into retail, like selling into a Stop and Shop or a Kroger versus a food service route to market.
Yep. Food service route to market, working with a broadline distributor, it's hard to get traction there. And that traction for smaller entrepreneurs or sort of niche tends to start because you're working locally with, for instance, a lot of the universities here in Rhode Island will partner with makers because you can go and deliver the product yourselves. And then a broadline salesperson will actually see it. And that's sort of how you move through those channels. Many of the broadliners also connect with some of the big distributors. So it's kind of this, again, weird relationship. US Foods may not buy directly. They're buying through a series of brokers, right? So you have to still make that connection. Selling to retail is always, to me, simpler in the fact that you can work with some of these smaller distributors. You can have relationships with local, the Daves, I think of Urban Greens here, to have those relationships where you can start to get that kind of traction, which then gets you shelf space, which gets you recognized and hopefully where everyone wants to see it go.
Kelley, any additional thoughts on that? Or Hillary?
I definitely agree with that. For retail, for a brand like mine that makes CPG iced tea, we definitely make much bigger margins in retail. With food service, you're competing with these big brands, these Coca-Cola, this Pepsi, so a lot of those distributors don't want to, there would be a lot of education that they would have to provide to the buyer, to the end consumer, on why we're $3 and Coke is $1.50. So a lot of distributors don't really want to deal with that at this point. So it's definitely for us, specifically for Granny Squibb, much more profitable to do retail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would just, go ahead.
Nope, Hillary, please.
Oh, I was just going to add, keeping in mind that usually you'll need a different broker for food service. There are people who specialize in that or agencies that specialize in that, and you should definitely invest in those. And then keep in mind that you may have to have different packaging, sizing, which could, have implications for your manufacturing and whether your manufacturing needs multiple lines or different lines for food service size, quantities, and packaging. So there are a lot of other things to think about when you're thinking about moving into food service. Some brands provide their product as an ingredient in another food service product as opposed to a finished product itself. So then there are other considerations with that as well.
No, you're absolutely right. The margins and the revenue that you'll get per unit, per whatever in food service is a fraction of what you would get in retail. And there are certainly, brokers who are very food service specific and small versus retail. And you'll need, again, it's part of picking and choosing where you go because you're adding complexity if you're trying to go after both of them at the same time. And, there is a bit of this hybrid where we're increasingly seeing companies work with meal kits, which are not food service, they're not retail, they're somewhere in between, and it's a sampling opportunity. You're not going to make a lot of money there, but it's a way to get your brand out there, drive trial, and then make sure that you have someplace very close by to whoever is getting that meal kit to pick up your full-size product at a better margin at retail. So understanding the dynamics across those is really important. Now, speaking of distributors, we have a question about, is it crazy to set up my own sales and distribution process? Like, do I have to work with these people or can I just go on my own? Discuss.
I've had that thought so many times, probably weekly. I'm like, can we just do this? Can we just plan these logistics and get a bunch of vans and do it ourselves? It's expensive and it's so time consuming to be actually delivering yourself, managing all these accounts. Once you get past, we have about 1,200 accounts, and to be contacting them, taking orders, coordinating delivery, it's worth having a distributor. You can do it on your own. You can choose to, depending on your exclusives with your distributor and your agreements, you can choose to service certain chains. If you wanted to service Just Dave's Marketplace on your own, you could do that and you would get a bigger margin, or just, the Plant City locations or that kind of thing. But, to me, it seems next to impossible to be able to build that out when you're a stage 1 brand.
And it increases your labor and your costs, which increase your overhead, which reduces the bottom line, says the P&L girl.
We'll get you a t-shirt with that, Maggie. Yeah, it's a perfect example of that conversation of, as you grow, you can't keep building the plane and flying the plane all yourself. And you start to have to pick what area you're going to lean hard into, and then what area you're going to leverage other people's expertise on. Because you're absolutely right, Kelley. Once you start to get into the work of a distributor, you realize how enormous and in some cases mind-numbing that detail is of tracking every shipment, every promotion, all of that. And you both appreciate it. And also, it becomes part of that negotiation over pricing on that. I'm looking to see, because I think we've got probably space for one or two. So we have an interesting question about more broadly around presenting yourself, presenting your product when you think about sales meetings. And I would put, distributor meetings and co-manufacturers and retailer meetings. How do you best present yourself, being confident, but what has been important, as you have been in these meetings to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for? And I think this is probably a question that all of you can answer in various ways.
You have to make sure that your brand reflects part of who you are, because you are out there every single day representing your brand, and you cannot fake that all the time. So you need to make sure that your brand reflects who you are as a person and you live those values. As far as presenting to distributors or sales teams, be as clear as you possibly can, as simple as you possibly can. A lot of times when I go into those meetings, sales meetings, I'll start from right here. I'll assume they know that we donate a portion of our proceeds to Save the Bay and Dana-Farber, where, No, they need to know that we're organic, that we're vegan. We need to start right at the bottom. They need to know what kind of packaging we have, not what we plan to do with our branding. So making sure you do that, and people have they'll pay attention to you for 25 seconds, if you're lucky. So make sure you hit the points, you give them, value proposition right away. I think that.
Excellent. Well, and I think that idea of your product and your presentation has to be authentic.
Mhm.
You are your product and your product is you when you are a founder, when you are a leader in that way. And lining it up gives you that confidence in some ways. We have just a few minutes left. I will flag to everybody, there are a few questions that have been answered in the Q&A. So for example, we've had a couple of questions about incubators or accelerators. We have a couple of those listed, including Hope in Maine in Rhode Island, Commonwealth Kitchen, and Foundation Kitchen in Massachusetts. So keep an eye out because there's some answers in the Q&A. And so I'll have one final round robin, which is for each of you, if there's one piece of advice that you would give to a food founder that is looking to scale their business, what would that be? So Hillary, I will begin with you.
In general, just picking the right partners, whether it's on the distribution side, the sales side, the manufacturing side, just really making sure it's a good fit and a win-win for both parties will save you a lot of time and a lot of headache going forward.
Words to live by. Kelley.
I have two real quick. The first is to live a year ahead in your business plan. If you plan to expand distribution or co-packing, start a year before, start those relationships. If you need funding, start a year before. I know that's really hard when you're growing, like a lot of these founders are, but do your best. You need the money yesterday. And then my second thing is finding industry mentors and friends that can help you and that can give you perspective. A lot of us have all been through this. So you use that. Call us, ask for help. We can get you out of the weeds. And I know that brands like John from Yacht Club Soda and Sean from Narragansett or Sean from Revival, Mark from Narragansett, like Granny Squibbs wouldn't exist without those people. I've been crying in my house, wondering what's going to happen. And, they talk you down, they help you. So find friends.
Thank you. Maggie.
So I amplify plan ahead, plan backwards, right? Review. But I think my biggest thing is breathe. You have to sit back, Kelley. Like Kelley says, in her house crying when it's so upsetting. It's okay. Reach out. Call me. Call one of us. But breathe a minute because it's probably not as dire as you think. It just feels that way because you're so emotional.
Mm-hmm. Even more words to live by. Scaling a food business is not for the faint of heart. It is incredibly challenging. It is incredibly satisfying. And, for all of the founders and the cheerleaders on the sidelines who are on this call, reach out to the folks who are here, reach out to us at Branchfood. We'll put the link to sign up for our newsletter so you can hear the latest about us and learn more about us and connect with us because we really, we are here to be a resource and to help you breathe and help you take a step back and figure out, the what of where you want to be, as you said, Kelley, what you want to do in a year and the how. We're all here, to support you in that way. So I want to thank each of you. This was tremendous. There is a recording for this, and we will be sharing it with the attendees after the fact. I will also put a plug in. We just included in the chat the community table, which is something that we do at Branchfood, where it is really just an informal gathering of folks in the ecosystem and the opportunity to say, here's what I have to offer and here's what I have as an ask. So that's at noon today. You're welcome to join that. We have them going forward as well. But thank you again. Thank you for the attendees. Thank you for the panelists. This was a wonderful discussion, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you joining and wish you all the best as you scale your food businesses.